All right. So, Dr. Candice, we are so excited to have you with us. Thanks so much for being here. We've been a little bit geeking out, going through all of your info and looking into what you do a little bit. And we're really excited for this conversation. Can
The
you start off
enthusiasm is
by...
mutual.
Aw. I love it. Well, can you tell us just a little bit about how you came into doing the work that you do now? A little bit of the
Yeah.
background story.
Okay. So my origin story. Um,
Origin.
I have really been interested in sexual wellness and sexual health and like what the body can do way earlier than people might imagine. So like 8 or 9 year old me with my grandma's Encyclopedia Britannica looking up when I'm gonna get boobs. Like that. that
I
that
feel
was
that.
like, when is it going to happen for me? And it never did. So let's just put that out there. But
Same girl, same.
right. But so I've always been intellectually precocious. And then when I found out through reading Cosmo Mag and stuff like that, like sex was a thing, it's like, I'm curious about this. I became the kid in high school who would be teaching my peers about sex ed and stuff like that. Like, this
Same
is
girl,
what you
same,
have to
by the
do.
way.
Yes.
So did that.
Yes. This is what you have to do
Yep.
to have the best sex according to Cosmo, like stuff like that. And so then when I became, when I was in college, I knew I wanted to be a psychologist when I was 16, but I took the circuitous route. So when I got to college and grad school and found out you could be a sex therapist and you could study sex research, I was like, this is a thing. This is a really, really good thing. And I was grateful to be able to do that and learn all the techniques and stuff like that, but also have my own period of reflection on my sexual well-being and development. And so that makes for someone who has a really good time doing the science, I call it hot girl science, and a great time doing the therapy, although I do a lot less therapy now.
Do you feel like when you were younger, was there, how do I word this question? Like, as you were getting into the research component and you were kind of fascinated by it, kind of more like left-brained, were you seeing how it was playing out in your actual life? Like the integration of being, because I know for me, obviously studying psychology, you weave in your life experience as you're learning about it and you're growing. What's that like when you're kind of studying more of like the sex psychology side?
Absolutely the same.
Yeah.
So finding out the language for what you have experienced, like, oh, attachment, aha, or, like whatever the thing is, it feels affirming. It feels grounding to have that language. And then to be able to study it and to find out what other scientists have said and how it departs from my experience at the intersection of Black womanhood or how it aligns with my experience, and I'm like, oh, okay. So I get to ask these research questions that haven't been asked before based on my standpoint. So it's been fun all the way around to get the language for it and then to be able to create the language for it too.
Yeah, I'm so curious about I would love to hear some more about your experience growing up as a Black woman in the context of your sexuality. And here's why. Something Vanessa and I were talking about before you hopped on is, as a Black woman, I feel like my experience is a little bit interesting in that I grew up in a predominantly white environment. I was certainly socialized. Same girl, same, as I said. This is interesting then, right? Because I feel like there are certain ways that I noticed, like, we were talking about like me going to the South to visit my cousin and, like being around Black kids whenever I was young, but there would be ways that sexuality was talked about differently, or there was like a little bit less of like I guess shame is the word that's coming up, or like it was just like the Black girls would be a lot more,
like less taboo, maybe?
Maybe. Yeah. And then also like, some of what you were saying about like how Black girls are like just societally seen as a little bit more fast, a little bit more sexual. And so I love hearing that you grew up similarly and what you've come to understand about your upbringing versus what might be the upbringing of a Black girl who grew up in a more Black environment and how that impacts how we feel about sex.
So similar to you, growing up in predominantly white spaces, I noticed how I was sexualized, or that felt to me at that time like my only currency for romantic involvement, because I'm a dark-skinned, kinky-haired Black girl in a predominantly white area. And so they're like, you're not exactly who we can take home, but we'd be curious to explore. Saying all that to say, my white girlfriends were very much more explorative around their sexuality than the Black girls in the community that I was raised in, even though the Black girls were sexualized more. And so
Yes.
we were talking about with my white homegirls, like oral and things like that very early on in our high school career. And Black girls were like, we don't do that. Like, that is not us. And I was like, isn't it us too, though? So
Yeah.
I was kind of the bridge between those worlds. And that bridging process is exhausting in and of itself, because I feel like I'm brokering cultural currency both ways and not fitting into any of them, really.
Yeah, there's Danae and I have talked about this before, but there was a TikTok that I sent to her. This woman was talking about Disney, right? And she was saying, like, if you look at all of the women of color, girls of color in Disney and how they're portrayed, even in their clothing, right, versus all of the white girls. So like she was saying, she's like, look at Esmeralda, because she was just watching that movie, and so it made her think. And she was like, Esmeralda, like hypersexualized, the way that she dresses, the way that she dances, the way that she uses her body. She's like, you would never see Cinderella wearing something like that. You would never see Snow White wearing something like that when you look at how much skin they show. And then a friend of mine that I sent it to, who a white woman who has a little girl, said, I thought about that exact concept the first time I saw Moana. And I thought, if that was a toddler, so for those who haven't seen Moana, when Moana's a baby or a toddler, they show her with just her little kind of swim underwear on, and she doesn't have a top on. And she's like, they would never have shown a white toddler without a top on.
Wow, I didn't even think of it. And I mean, I haven't seen Moana, but yeah, that makes sense to me, though.
Just like the hypersexualizing of women of color, girls of color, right? Versus what we see out there with white girls. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fascinating. But I'm also so curious at what point some of that is internalized. Because as you were speaking, Candice, I was like, yes, that was very much my experience as well. Like, you would be sort of the object that was like appealing to sort of like explore, but you certainly like, we would never introduce you to mom and dad. But also, I feel like there is a little bit of an internalization.
Yeah.
Well, but what I was going to say is I think there's a little bit of an internalization on the part of white women, white girls at some point. And I'm curious when you think that happens, of like, no, like, don't be a slut. Don't be that, that person that is just about like sex. So maybe it's like when we're younger, we're all a little bit more curious. We're all a little bit more exploratory. But at some point, it feels like some of that patriarchal shame around sensuality is internalized. Well, maybe across the board, but I want to hear what you think.
Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely think it's internalized across the board, because that's how patriarchy works. But then there's this added element. So, we're talking about intersectionality. There's this added element of like Black women serving as the cautionary comparison tale of like, that they'll typically end up pregnant and end up single moms, and all of these like scripts that are very subtle. No one even has to say it out loud, but it's like, don't be like that. And then as you age, as you develop, and your proximity to whatever power you're going to have as an adult comes about, you start thinking about that and navigating how you show up, your sexual reputation management, if you will. Even if the behaviors are the same, like you have to advocate for your position in this human hierarchy, which is sucky. But I think that is what most of us learn to do early on. And then now maybe in our 30s or 40s, we begin divesting from it. Some of the younger folks in their 20s are divesting from it now, and I love them for that. But it took me to like mid 30s. I just hit 40 this year, where I was like, I'm buy into that anymore. I reject that, actually.
I like wrote that down. Sexual reputation management. And that's fascinating to me, because I think there's a moment where you start to see some of these things that like nobody talks about societally are socioeconomic things. Like I remember having friends that their parents were so anti-abortion until it was their daughter, and they had the socioeconomic means to make that problem go away. And a lot of times what would happen in different socioeconomic communities was they didn't have the means to make the problem go away, right? And so these are the things that nobody's talking about, right? Like same sexual exploration, same maybe like being a kid and getting yourself into situations that, like life things happen, but there's just a different level of management of what we do to clean it up. Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah.
Wow.
And what we think it means if we don't, like, if you don't have the means for it, then you don't deserve it.
Yes. Yes. I was thinking when you were saying that, Danae, how, you know, my mom, so, I mean, I won't go too much into my background, but like single mom, bartender, like I was like the quote unquote bartender's kid by like the richer parents in the area.
Mm-hmm.
And my mom was like the safe space that all the girls would come to talk about sex and sexuality, because she was always very open about it. And it was like there was no shame, there was no judgment, there was no whatever. And so a lot of these girls who had like the quote unquote rich parents, you know, which rich for my area, you know, meanwhile, they couldn't talk to their parents about anything. And then the bartender's mom or kid or whatever is the one who they came to talk. And it's just really interesting when you were saying that today. I was thinking, oh, isn't that interesting that my mom was the one that people came to, right? And we were like the lower middle class, whatever that is.
Yeah. And then using people who have lower SES as safe space, you know, like brokering that privilege of like, well, I get to tell you here because if stuff hits the fan, I don't know if I can cuss, but if stuff hits the fan, nobody, you know, like, then you get to be a safe space, and that's your lot in life, to like listen to all my woes and like me to dump emotionally on you and all of these things. And then if stuff hits the fan, it's like, I didn't really say that to them. Or, you know, people thinking that you were going to be the one to be in trouble, or you were going to be the one who wasn't successful because of your lower SES background, and having to navigate like being really smart or being really, you know, all of these things, and parents having these judgments about you and like, don't hang out with her, because when we were all doing the same thing. Really, or maybe the wealthier kids were doing a bit more because they had access to like alcohol and all that stuff that couldn't afford to buy. So yeah.
Yeah, I'm just like sort of fascinated as I'm listening to you, and maybe this is that you work with a younger demographic. There's parts of our adolescence or our childhood that I feel like we sort of like not rewrite in our heads, but we forget about, right? Like I'm forgetting about the level of sexual promiscuity. I can't find the word. I'm like,
expressiveness.
Thank you.
Of my peers, like, you know, that we were all like drunken free for all like makeout parties, and
it was the best, actually.
Can we just call it what it is? It was the best.
Yeah, had so much fun. Let me just say that.
Thank God I'm not dead, but I had so much fun.
Facts.
Well, but let's go there for a second, right? Because as you guys are saying, so much fun. Yes, and right, like I was sort of that girl, like that was very drunk for a large portion of my developmental years, but I didn't enjoy sex. It was completely performative. It was completely like how this person is experiencing me. Does this person like who I think is the cool guy, like think I'm hot? Like I'm excited about like him choosing to be with me in this moment, but it was never about my pleasure. It was never like actually about my internal experience. And I find that is something that, as I work with women in their late 30s and 40s, that's something that has continued. Sex has never actually been about my internalized experience of pleasure. It's very performative. It's very like, I am the object for this other person to enjoy sex. But I'm curious what that brings up for you, Candice.
I'm sitting with that because I feel like it was both and. I have largely had good sex. And
lucky woman. Give us your tips.
There was also this.
That's great.
There was also this pornographic perfectionism I was striving for, right? So I had to be good at it. I felt like I had to be good at everything, right, including sex. And so if I was going to have it, it was going to be good for me, but also nobody was going to be able to say I wasn't good at it. You know, like, so there was this, me still like navigating what my body looks like. Okay, I run track and I'm a cheerleader, and so that's important. And is it going to be good for me to, like, I'm going to have sex with people that I want to have sex with? And I think the qualifier that you added there is I didn't drink or or use substances in high school or college. And so I was always knowing what I was getting into because I wasn't under the influence of anything, but I was watching other people use the substances to kind of navigate those inhibitions. And so my inhibitions were realizing what I wanted to do. And I think that might have been the difference maker there. So I was still doing the performance of gender, the performance of like sexual prowess, this like internalized idea of what a Black girl should be, all of these things. But at the end of the day, I was still very much curious about it and wanted to have the sex and had a good time with it. So I think that might have been the difference maker for me.
So consciousness.
I was conscious. Yes, I was conscious. I'm making this decision today. I am going out the window today. You know, I'm going out this window at this time. And it was very conscious the whole time.
No, but that's a really good point. I mean, I don't think I started having sex not under the influence like that until I was in some of my relationships later on in life, right? Even in my relationships when I was younger, it was almost always under the influence. And I think when I started realizing what you're saying, Danae, the performative aspect of it, I think I started coming into an awareness of that and then an anger and then a rage around that when I started having sex more consciously and started realizing I wasn't necessarily getting the pleasure that I wanted. I wasn't,
and deserved.
Yes. And I think it wasn't until I started having sex consciously that I started being like, wait a second, maybe I'm not having as much fun as I thought I was because I was always drunk or high when I was having sex when I was younger. So it's a really good point. I never thought about it like that.
Yeah. What I think is interesting though, and I think this is a part of, what my progression and what I really talk to women a lot about sexually, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this, is so much of why I think, and you spoke to this, we do that is because it lowers the inhibitions and it's not as vulnerable, right?
Yes.
And so I think there's such a normalized sense of, and I've come to the point where like I sort of connect sex and spirituality so like they're so intertwined for me that it's like this is like an experience of transcendence. This is us like connecting to another like spiritual being in the space of union through sex. So I don't think sex is casual for me anymore. Like I don't hold it that way, but I'm saying that to say I think so often we have societally normalized physical intimacy without a lot of emotional intimacy.
Yes.
And I don't feel emotionally safe with this person, but I will allow them to have access to my body in a very intimate way. And I think there's a disconnect that often comes with that, that can feel really sort of self-abandoning or dishonoring of self in a way that I feel like we don't talk about a lot. It's like, I love what you're saying because you were young and able to be that conscious. But I think a lot of what we as women were taught in terms of modern feminism was like, we can have sex just like men with like, it doesn't matter. We can have sex with as many people as we want and feel nothing. But that wasn't actually like the truth of what it felt like. And there wasn't a lot of emotional safety in that a lot of times. And so I think it was a little bit of gaslighting ourselves on a lot of levels. You know what I mean?
That hits because a lot of the generation under us are now doing these videos. I'm seeing a lot of them on YouTube around like, sex positivity was a sham. They were like, we thought it was going to be this and sexual liberation was going to be this. And you just tied those knots for me where maybe the way the approach to sex positivity or the way it was sold was the marketing was terrible. And it wasn't like, this is an autonomous, you make the decision. There is vulnerability involved. Do you have the capacity to risk it? Like, what is your pleasure? That's what sexual liberation could be or can't, is, as opposed to like, how many bodies do I get to experience?
Well, and then there's such a disconnect between that messaging that we got as women under the sexual liberation and under, like you were saying, modern feminism today, and then out of the other side of the mouth of like, sex is something we do in marriage and, it's only with people that you love. When two people, this idea of like where babies come from, when two people fall in love and they decide to blah, 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 and so you're getting very different messages of what sex and sexuality is and when is it love and when is it not love, which I have actually found, and Danae and I are very different in this, that I I actually have always enjoyed casual sex. I mean, I guess enjoyed as much as I could when I was in my 20s and I was drunk a lot, but there was something very liberating I found in that. And it didn't always need to be in relationship for me. I didn't always need to feel super connected. For me, sometimes I could just be like, you hot. Like, I want to do this, you know? And I think sometimes the messaging that we get around, like, when two people fall in love, this is what they do, can then also in a way almost be shaming of, yeah, but I own this and I want to do this and he wants to do this or she wants to do this and we're both consenting adults. And so why not have fun and have pleasure and enjoy each other? And I do feel like if you're going into it consciously, you can still enjoy casual sex as like, there's a spiritual component to it. And this other being and I are sharing in this amazing union. And then maybe that's it. Like, that's all we were meant to kind of come together and do. But that shaming around, like, you only do this with people you love. I don't know. I think that can be really also harmful and detrimental when people are experimenting and in that age.
Because it kind of connects to mononormativity and like this privilege you get from partnering.
Yes.
And so it's like, you're really only worth anything if somebody chooses you.
100%.
You know, and so it's like, we might be choosing each other for this moment, sharing the sexual experience, and that is liberating and it's fun and it's enjoyable and it's good.
Yeah.
And we might not choose each other for romantic involvement or commitment or all of these things. And for me, it was really tough to parse that out in my 20s because I was so invested in elitism. And in all the ways elitism can show up. And it was like, so I need to be chosen by one of these guys for commitment, even though I just really kind of want to have sex with him. He's not my type intellectually, like he doesn't do it for me, but the status involved with being chosen by him is valuable to me at this juncture. And so in addition to the sex I want to have, I also have to now act like a really good girlfriend. Like, I didn't want to do that. You know, like that's the part I did not want to do that I did. Or I felt like it was gonna buy me, it was gonna purchase me something that I was looking to get at that time.
You just gave me some ahas around that for sure. Like, if I didn't want that, and I was very aware that I didn't want that, but I almost forced myself into a space of pretending that I wanted that because there's an elitism in that. Him choosing me to have this amazing sexual experience for some reason couldn't have been enough. He had to then also choose me to want to be partnered because for some reason that meant more. When in actuality, it didn't really, because I didn't even really want
Well,
that.
you're talking about patriarchy and sexism, right? And like devaluing women who can be chosen in one way and not the other way. It's like, well, there's these are the wives. And these are the girlfriends, and these are the sluts. And it's like,
Madonna horror.
Right.
Madonna horror complex, right?
Well,
Right.
And what I think is interesting, though, and what I hear in what you're saying that is so brilliant is that I don't think that there's like an equation of like feeling safe is not the same thing as necessarily needing to be chosen for a partnership. And I think that sometimes where we shame ourselves as women is that if I want to feel a level of emotional safety, some of that is biological because some of us, and this isn't conscious, but like we have that awareness that like, if I were to get pregnant, there's a different level of responsibility. Some of these things are the things that, like, I just feel like we've been shamed for sometimes like when women will be like, no, I can have sex with whoever. And then something happens and like this might have started out as casual sex or friends with benefits or situations.
Catching feelings is like shamed.
And I feel needy. I feel shamed. And it's like, no, there's a difference sometimes in like what comes up for us once we come into that level of intimacy. And I also like don't want any women listening to this to sort of continue to perpetuate that level of shame if that's not how you feel once things get started, because I feel like that is another way that society has gaslit women for.
Because we can evolve and our needs can shift, and that's normal. And the fact that we even call it, so I have a paper on this, right? One of my mentees co-authored this with me called Catching Feelings, because the participants in the study were talking about how they navigate intimacy through like a disease model. Yeah. And I'm like, oh no, what the heck? So they're like, you know, I want to have a sexual experience, but I don't want to catch feelings. So I'm not going to call this person for 3 days. And like all these little strategies for, it's like you have emotions because you are a human being and they can evolve. And maybe you didn't want this and now you do. And it's okay to have needs, and that it's okay to have needs. I don't know about y'all, but being raised by really smart and strong women, that was not the message I got. Like, it is not okay to have needs. It's not okay to expect other people to take care of your needs. So I was listening to y'all's episode about that type of vulnerability, and I was like, "Ooh, there's something for me." It's like wanting to be needed and needing and all of that stuff, and I was like, "Ooh, this gets at something for me." But I'm just now at the point where, like, my husband and I have had this conversation in the past few years where he's like, ask me for the small things. Like, you don't even ask me for the small things. He was like, it's not that I need to be needed, but you need to practice, because you will take ownership of a whole project or an experience or all of these things and be tired and resentful and wiped out. You have needs because you're a human. Ask me, like, have that conversation with me. And I was like, I don't need. Okay.
Shush,
I guess
stop
I'll practice.
saying me like that.
Right. I was like, I don't have needs.
You're right. It's such a like complex animal, because so many of us as women, and this is from my perspective, the ways that we've been shamed out of our feminine, and don't be needy, and like, don't, be the cool girl. Don't be the girl who's like all like clingy and all of the things. But like, I still will have like a visceral response to being needy, or even like I struggle with, the term having needs is something my therapist and I go back and forth about constantly. But that I have really framed it in the context of desires, because it feels more digestible to me a lot of times. And I think that even having desires as women, desires to like, not just sexually, but like desires to be held, desires to be able to soften into someone, desires to be able to trust, the masculine or the man, if we're speaking heteronormatively. But, I'm curious to hear, you talk a lot about like gender roles and sort of like challenging some of these ideas. And I'd love to hear you talk more about that, because I think, well, let me just hear your thoughts on like sort of redefining what we are classifying in terms of gender roles in sex.
Yeah, I think every human being has desires. And we get gendered and coded for what desires we're allowed to articulate and which ones we are not. And so then these ideas of like real men, or like a specific type of masculinity, or real women, or a specific type of femininity are the templates, and anything you do outside of that, whether or not we've divested from it intellectually, is still sanctioned socially. Yes. So then who you have access to as partners is coded along these lines, and what things you're allowed to express and with whom around your desires, like even the way you ask for what you want, the way you communicate your desires, all of these things have this gendered, sexist, heteronormative coding around them.
Will you speak a little bit more about that? Like, give examples, because that's really interesting to me. I've never thought about even just like the desires or the needs that we're allowed to have, and then even in the way we communicate them. Can you speak more about that? Yeah.
And so there's an intersection of race and class around this too. So I don't want to leave all these pieces out, right? But so what I get coded as androgynous based on the way I look. And so people don't expect me to want softness or to be coddled or held. And people don't make room for that most of the time. And so when my husband's like, ask for that, I'm like, why would I ask for something that people don't think I expect or, should have, or like, why I've learned to give it to myself because of all of that coding, all of that, like there's a specific way Black women are gendered around that. Black women who like me are gendered. And so when I recognize that I have those needs and that I'm trying to take care of all of them myself, which isn't humanly possible because we're a collective. When I ask them, I feel incredibly vulnerable. And I also might still be socially sanctioned. Well, you're a strong Black woman. You need to act like this and be like this. And you shouldn't depend on a man for anything and all. And I'm like, but actually, I would like to in this particular situation. And so I think those pieces can get into it. So there are ways that in my community, based on being a Black girl who grew up in predominantly white areas, in a low SES family, all of these intersections, it's like, you really don't get to have any needs, and your responsibility is to take care of everyone else.
Yes. Yes.
Oof. And the men in my life who grew up in similar things are like, we don't really have very high expectations of you. So whatever you do is going to be regaled. You made it? Yeah, promising. It's amazing. But I think that looks different when you're white. I think that looks different, like the ideas of masculinity are based on like a white het patriarchal norm. And so it's like, for white men, I had this conversation on another podcast. He was like, I'm supposed to have this amount of money. I'm supposed to work. I'm supposed to be strong and have like maybe a few friends, but we shouldn't be that emotionally close to each other. And, I'm supposed to be tough. And, these are the tasks that I have in the household. And he was like, I might want more emotional intimacy than people give me access to. And if I ask for it from my friends, my male friends in particular, I am going to be shamed. Yeah. So those are some of the examples.
Yeah, even breaking it down to like the tasks that we have in the household, right? I mean, when you think about it like that, and like what you're actually socialized to believe and others are socialized to believe are your responsibility, what you should want, what you shouldn't want, what you're allowed to have, what you're not allowed to have. That's just so fascinating. I'm thinking about how like my point of overwhelm consistently, whether it's like personal life, friend life, work life, is always getting really overwhelmed with the production aspect, like producing all the things. So like the details and the execution and like juggling all the balls and spinning all the plates. And I'm good at it because I've had to be, but I hate it more than anything. And it's the thing that sends me into panic, overwhelm, frustration, resentment. I mean, all the things that I don't want to be, that's what sends me to that place. Yes. And as you were saying, that just clicked for me. Like there's something about also that's just been expected of me my whole life. Like this is what you do, right? This is what you should do. This is what you should be good at. So you don't get to say you don't want to, right? Or that you can't. It's just what you do, and it's been coded into us. And that is just like I don't know, there's something in that just clicked for me, because even outside of sex, just the way you show up in society has been coded into you, based on, to your point, like race, socioeconomic status, like all these things. Yeah. So interesting.
I had the example that I shared with y'all. So my husband is a chef and he's the person who cooks. And people are like, oh, you must be lucky. That is amazing. And I'm like, it is. I love it. Don't get me wrong. But if I were the person who were the chef and who cooked, nobody would be like,
to him,
look at this. Well, maybe some people in the manosphere would be like, it's rare to find a woman who cooks these days. But like that.
Yeah.
But people wouldn't be like my grandma's generation would work hours and hours in factories and then still make. And I'm like, how did you survive that? How did you survive making meals for people when you get home? I don't have energy for any of this. And so, those expectations, so we're still playing with those gender roles.
Yeah. And it's interesting because for me, there's a part of what is, carried forward from childhood is the codependency piece. Because yes, we might have gotten messaging in positive reinforcement when we took on tasks, or not being needy and like being able to be the child that was able to take care of things ourselves. And so there was positive reinforcement, and that was what was internalized. But then what that carries into in adulthood, from my perspective, is a lot of times the way I maintain attachments, the way that I stay close to other people is by being pleasing, by doing these tasks, but then I carry resentment. And so for me, what I see so often with couples is when someone has like been in the space of attempting to meet the needs of others for so long, and they've been carrying resentment for so long, the transition into I can have needs, or I get to have needs, doesn't sound like a need. It sounds like a demand, and it sounds like a demand with resentment. And so for me, that's a little bit why with couples, especially, I play in the realm of desires, because it's like, I'm still responsible for the way that I'm showing up, and whether or not someone has the capacity to meet me, and they might not always in this moment, right? But that's information for me, right? Like I can make a request, but a lot of times it's like, I'm demanding this need. I'm demanding this need be met right now.
And evaluating you based on your capacity to give me that, to meet that demand.
Yep.
Absolutely. And I feel like there's just such an adversarial energy that often comes into our relationships when it's like, no, I need my needs to be met. And so it's like the pendulum swings so far from I don't get to have any needs to I am demanding my needs be met. And I'm feeling a whole lot of resentment about the fact that I might not be having my needs met by this particular person in this particular way. You know what I mean?
Because that's another vulnerability avoidance strategy. So if I pop off on you about not meeting needs, I don't have to ask. Now I'm demanding because that feels much less vulnerable than asking and giving
Mhm.
somebody the ability to consent or not. That's why it's, for me, it's tied to sexuality and how we express ourselves in so many ways. Because if you, like you said, if you express a desire for something and then you leave breathing room for a person to consent or not, you got to wait and listen to what they're navigating or negotiating as they decide whether they can consent. And then you've got to tolerate that rejection or whatever emotion comes up. And it's not actual rejection, but you're feeling whatever you're feeling around it. But if you demand, it's like you failed because you didn't meet my need. That's like really easy.
That was just like one of those like mic drops.
Yes.
I am obsessed with what.
Oh, I'm just speaking what I live, so I know.
No, I mean, shit.
Speaking
I'm
my
like,
own
So
shit.
big. I don't
So
know,
big.
like everybody rewind that, write that down. That was potent.
But you know what's so interesting about that? Because Danae and I have talked recently about this. We both have clients like this and like personal experiences and all these things around, you know, it's just this like this cultural messaging around like the frigid woman and like she never wants to have sex and the guy always wants to have sex. And so many of my couples, right? It's like the man's like, wow, woe is me. She never wants to have sex with me. And this is dance and this back and forth, right? And what you're saying is so interesting because so often the men that I again, heteronormatively, I watch the men like act out or pout or tantrum or whatever, right? That looks like, which then obviously pushes the partner away even more, but that doesn't feel vulnerable, right? Like that feels like a demand versus actually communicating what the authentic, vulnerable desire is, which is like to connect, to, you know, be seen by you, to be
Feel
physically
desired.
close to you,
feel
just that
desired.
desire to feel desired. Yeah. Yeah.
Ooh, yeah, that is, yep. That's it right there.
So
And
how do you then
they
play
got the
with these,
power of
Candice?
patriarchy
Go
around
ahead.
it. Where they've
Yes.
got the power of patriarchy around it when they're like, see, she's not fitting the mold. So she's not good enough as a girlfriend or a wife because she's not fitting that mold. So the power of patriarchy allows you to defend against your emotional vulnerability.
Yeah, it's just, I'm like so many light bulbs as you're speaking because it's like the way that patriarchy has pinned us against one another in relationships. So it's so adversarial because so often, to the point that Vanessa's making, there's like the vulnerability in longing to connect, longing to be desired by my partner. But then there's also like the part that we don't talk about is like the only hand women, if we're speaking heteronormatively, a lot of times have to play is withholding sex because it becomes like the one thing that I can weaponize. And, you know, this is like where my power is. I hold the card to sex, and that's sort of like historically been the case. But yeah, it's just like we're in this like power struggle instead of that space of vulnerability with one another.
So Candice, how would you say, like, how do we play then with gender roles in a way that enriches our sex life?
I think we're having a good conversation in that direction because we're identifying what we've been taught.
Yeah.
And so I always start with that step for folks because we don't often interrogate it. We just kind of swam in that water for however long we've been alive. And now it's time to write it down, make it plain. Like, what have you been taught about what it means to be a real woman or a real man if we're talking about heteronormative, or even if we're talking about being a person that's trans or gender expansive, there are codes still. Like, this is what it means to be a good trans person or a good trans man. So writing down what you were taught, all the messages, and if you can find out, like if you can even go further and figure out who said it or where you heard it from, that gives you a bit more to play with. But even if you can't, these are the messages I've been socialized into. And then circling the ones that actually vibe for you so that you know, like, there's nothing wrong with even these traditional ways of doing gender or expansive ways of doing gender if you consent into them. Like, if they really work for the way, like your values, if they're really value congruent, basically. So writing down that, and then there may be some in the real man category that work well for you, even if you don't identify as a man. So figuring out, like, these are the attributes that have been ascribed to these specific genders. These are the attributes that are really congruent with who I am, who I know myself to be, that really work for me, that are value congruent. And then if you're partnered, You can talk about why they matter with your partner. And if not, you can journal about that or talk with friends or your therapist about, this is what I learned. These are the parts that really resonate for me. And these are the parts that I'm still adopting, even though they suck. Like they just don't work for me at all. Figuring out how I get my needs met or realize my desires or experience my gender or my partnering with someone when they don't have the capacity to be that type of man or woman that I think they should have been. How do I deal with that? Because that opening up is such a practice where if you're doing it with someone you're engaging with sexually, now you're seeing each other. You're also knowing what standards you've been holding each other to. And if you're in a good place, you get to forgive each other around that and connect in that way.
I love that. And I love the idea of holding it as something that is a continuous dialogue, because I think there's so many ways that a patriarchal structure also conditions us to hold things in a very linear way. Like we have a problem with sex and we are going to solve it. And this is what it is. And because we've laid out the guidelines and this is how we have sex and it's every single time and you're breaking the rules. And I think it's...
You're breaking the rules is it. Like people hate you breaking the rules.
Right. Yeah. And can it be alive? Can it be, because I think there's so much in the erotic realm of just continuously being present with what is and the fluidity of allowing ourselves to shift and change. And even some of what you're saying about gender roles, I think today, I feel like being in the more masculine energetic with my partner if I'm a core feminine woman, but that may not be the case tomorrow. I might want to be ravished by my tomorrow. But can all of it be welcome? Right?
Can all of it be welcome? And can you check in with each other? So setting time points, whatever works for you and your schedule and your, let's check in with each other. Because if we're going to allow each other to evolve in this relationship, we've got to recognize that we're not going to be the same. We're not going to be static. So I'm not Candice as mom to a toddler boy is not Candice as pre-children. And so if within the confines of my marriage, that was the expectation, that my libido would be the same, that my energy would be the same, that my interest would be the same. Ooh, you got another thing coming, So let's talk about how it's evolving.
Yeah, because, and I think that this is what so many couples struggle with is that we are meant to continuously evolve and change. And the person that I married is not going to, or, whatever my partnership model is not going to be the person that I'm with, 10 years from now. And I think that if we stay in a partnership with someone for a very long time, we will be in partnership with several different people because we are meant to change. But I think we expect that children from age 0 to 18 are going to change, but somehow societally we think that stops at 18 and we're just nope, we're grown now. This is the person I'm going to be. And it's not even a little bit. I'm a completely different human being than I was in my 20s. But if we're in partnership with someone, we have to allow space for that. We have to say, no, we're going to continue to change. How can we be present with the person that I'm with right now?
Somebody said, I don't know who said it, so if it was you, attribute it to yourself. But
oh, that was me. I'll just go ahead and take credit before you
they said that women partner expecting and hoping that their person will change, and men partner hoping that the person never changes. And I don't know that I don't want to essentialize gender in that way, but if that vibes for you, we might consider why we think that's the case.
Well, I don't know if it was me that said it when you heard it, but I do think that I speak to that quite often. And because I study masculine and feminine energetics quite a bit, and for the feminine, if we're speaking a core feminine, that is expansion, that is aliveness, that is continuous free flowing energy that is not static. The masculine is structure. The masculine is, the containment, the solid base of what things are. And so I think a lot of times for core masculine men, what makes sense is, I know what I'm going to get. I married this woman. This should be what it is. Why does she keep asking me to evolve and read books with her? I just want to sit here and be in the space of knowing what this is going to be. Just tell me how to do it and I'll do it. Right. And that makes sense. But for women, a lot of times it's just the space of no, we're in the constant state of expansion. And I am turned on by when my man is growing and, showing me something new that he is capable of. Whereas I think sometimes that can feel a little bit threatening to men. And some of that is the way that they're socialized to
I was just going to say
be something.
That, I want to add on to what you're saying, Danae, and say too, I do think that the patriarchal structure that we live in has, because it's stripped so much of the feminine from the men in our lives, right? Or just in society. I do think that women, there is this message that women get that we are the emotional saviors of the men in our lives. So if men are the physical saviors, women are the emotional saviors. And there is an expectation that if I'm good enough for him and he marries me, that he's going to find himself. He's going to potentially expand. He's going to learn. He's going to become more emotional. He's going to somehow, quote unquote, fix all of these problems and these issues that the patriarchy has done to him. And obviously that one person cannot, undo all of generations and centuries of patriarchal messaging. But then I think what happens is you see these women then say I'm not good enough, right? I'm not enough for you to want to change, because I think we put that on our own shoulders. I think we think that we are good enough to change our men. I don't know. Something I've been thinking about.
And don't let it be true as a therapist. You're this is what I was trained in, so I should definitely be able to change you.
Well, and I think that there's power in if I'm a man and speaking in the context of the way that we're talking about it, can I be in the space of acceptance of someone else continuously being, evolving and changing, and that is in no way a representation of my ineptitude or that I am not enough. But also, how do we as women take responsibility for, I'm not actually seeing and loving the person in front of me if I'm seeing them in the context of the potential for who they could be if I can just get in here and fix some things and move it around. That's not love for that person. That's me with a projection of who I think that this person should be in the future that I'm falling in love with, right?
Ooh, all the things, ladies, all the things.
I mean, I love this conversation with you, Candice. I feel like we could keep you forever. I'm that went really fast.
Right. I'm sitting here ooh, just checking my own stuff as we're talking about this.
I mean, that's real. I'm going to go back and listen to
ooh.
That's what happens, I guess, when you get three therapists on the line together.
Yes.
Oh, shit.
That mic drop moment. I got to go back and listen and dissect that a little bit. But let's get on to our lightning round. So, Candice, we have questions that we ask all of our guests at the end. And the first one is, who have been your greatest teachers, mentors, influences, whether they're people that you've known along your path or people who you've just been really impacted by their work?
Ooh, so people that I know, my grandmother, my maternal and paternal, but especially my paternal grandmother. My son is probably one of my best teachers. And for people that I haven't had a chance to meet, so Maya Angelou, Alice Walker, Audre Lorde. So when I think about Maya Angelou, writing about being a whore, I love that for some reason. And just being and Pulitzer Prize winning. I love that so much for some reason. But being able to name that part of her journey in all of these pieces, that taught me something about being a fast Black girl. And then Audre Lorde and her uses of the erotic and inviting us into self-preservation through self-care, that, love it. And Alice Walker for giving me womanism and just that as a model, a way of being in the world. So those are the folks that have taught me quite a bit.
I love how we have so many of the same heroes. You're my kind of people.
So the idea of flow, right? What is this thing for you that you can find yourself doing and you blink your eyes and an entire day has gone by? What is flow for you?
I feel like I've been so out of flow in the past few years. I'm feeling really distracted. And so a lot outside of flow in ways that I used to be, but writing used to be my thing. I could just write a story or read a story. Reading and writing, those used to be things that I could just lose a day and be learning something new. But now it feels really disjointed and choppy. So that was a good reminder. Maybe
can I name early motherhood as just a state of permanent distraction?
I think that makes sense. Yeah. So I'm just like, my spidey sense is always trying to like, are you safe somewhere in the world? That's a part of it for sure. But
What do I gotta
have
do?
invited some. Right. I have invited distractions too, though, for sure.
Yeah. Oh, finding flow as a mother, I think it's like a whole separate conversation. Like, how do we
If anybody
invite
wants to
flow?
teach that class, I will go.
Yeah, seriously.
And what breaks your heart?
Oh. Like seeing the light go out. So I used to be a high school teacher for a little while. Seeing the light go out or be dimmed in like teenagers' eyes, like that point where the world has fucked them over, and it's like they don't look like they're coming back from it. It's like that, just on a soul level. I only taught for 3 years. Like I really couldn't take it. And I work with people who've had deep trauma therapeutically and everything, but being in space with them 5 days a week and watching that process happen, it was just heartbreaking for me. So I think seeing that happen to anyone, but in particular for like Black kids growing up in rural and urban areas, like, and watching that moment happen, it makes me sick to my stomach and it breaks my heart.
Yeah, I just felt that in my body.
Yeah.
You said that.
And then here's the last one. It's the doozy. What's your favorite food?
I love food so much. I really, really love it. It's an erotic experience. Yes.
It is an erotic experience.
It is. It's so good.
That's exactly it. Like, everybody listening, food is an erotic experience. Thank you for
my
naming
goodness.
that.
So the desserts do it, especially. There's this restaurant in Atlanta called Poor Calvin's, and they have like a green tea pound cake with caramel and like a bourbon peach ice cream. And it's orgasmic. It is so good. Anybody who's ever watched me eat knows that.
Do you have
I'm
any
having an
Taurus
erotic-
in your chart? Do you know?
Do I have any what?
Taurus. Do you have any
I
Taurus?
thought you said porous.
Oh, that's what I thought you said too. I was like, wait a minute.
Porous.
I don't know. How would I know that? I'm a Capricorn. How would I know? My husband's a Taurus.
So much is becoming clear.
But we need to know where Taurus is. I feel
How do I find out?
Send us your birthday and where you were born.
Okay. I'll send you an app and you can send us your
I
chart.
need to know now. So yeah,
We're the people.
I get along very well with Tauruses and Virgos. So
of course you do. You're a
of course
North
you do.
Side, but
yeah. Oh, there we go. Okay.
And also, like, there's salty and sweet people, and I'm starting to understand that there's a very similar, like, overfunction or underfunctioner. That's fascinating. I love it.
I like the salty sweet combo though. It's like the caramel with the salt.
I'm the combo all the way.
It's the combo for me. Caramel is my favorite flavor. There,
so you got the salty and the sweet in one amazing combination.
Ooh. Butterscotch, caramel, toffee. Okay, please send me the link.
Please, Candice. We will send that to you when we're done.
We should start doing this with all of our guests, like how Jung used to go through the chart of all of his patients. Like, we should do this with our guests
beforehand.
Love it.
This is basically if Yoon had a podcast. So yes, do it.
That's true. Oh my
Today,
gosh,
light
Candice,
bulb.
You're the origination point of this idea.
Yes.
That's so good, V. Yeah.
Light bulb.
From now on, and we're gonna get yours so we can like talk about.
That's the fifth question.
I love this.
Love it.
This idea. All right. Well, Candice, you are an absolute joy. This has been such a fun conversation. I feel like we just scratched the surface, but thank you so much for being here and for the work that you're doing and for these mic drop moments.
Thank you for having me. This has been one of the best times I've had in a while. So thanks.
Where can our listeners find you? Where can they find you on all the things?
Oh, y'all can find me on my website, drcandicenicole.com, and on YouTube at Dr. Candice Nicole, Instagram. I'm more there than anywhere at Dr. Candice Nicole. There's a period after DR. Sometimes I'm on Facebook, rarely on Twitter. So, if the places I want to be found, YouTube and Instagram.
Well, amazing. Thank you so much for doing this. This was so much fun.
Thank you.